Good morning and welcome. We're going to hear today from Larry Haynes, who is the Executive Director of the Brattleboro Community Justice Center. In thinking about this in the last day or so, I don't want to say a lot. I am involved with the Justice Center. I'm on one of the reparative boards and on the advisory council. The thought that came to mind the other day is restorative justice restores the balance to the community, but the community is an integral part of maintaining that balance. So from that grand theoretical position, I'm going to hand it over to Larry for the more practical aspects and what's happening in community justice right now.
So welcome. Thanks. Great turnout. This is my first breakfast, I must say, and hopefully not my last because, well, the food's good and the conversation is even better. So I'm glad I'm here. And thanks for the invite, Mr. Ozier. So I've passed around something, a little visual aid that will make this hopefully a little more easy to digest. What we do is, I wouldn't say extremely complicated, but what our center does is maybe has a lot of little offshoots. So I've tried to capture that in this document, this diagram. We are, if anybody knows about the Community Justice Center, well, let me tell you if you don't, we are located in our town municipal center. We are kind of ironically 3 stories above the police department in our jail cells. So, and we often think of ourselves as an alternative way of working with conflict and crime. However, we're not mutually exclusive by any means, and there is quite a interplay between public safety, the criminal justice system, and restorative justice. We've been operating there above Town Hall in Town Hall for about 03, so that's 7-8 years now. And the way these community justice centers have come to be is that we started with about 8 or 9, and they've grown to 16 around the state. These are not nonprofits. These are Department of Corrections supported enterprises, and they are fully funded by the Department of Corrections, and they are attached to municipalities. So we have partner sites in St. Albans, to St. Jay, Rutland, Montpelier, down to, well, let's say Hartford, down here, Springfield. There are only a couple of parts of the state that aren't represented, one being Bennington, for some reason. Anyway, the towns back in the day had to invite this program or concept into the town, and Brattleboro definitely did that, which is great and would hopefully make sense. The idea of what we do here is we address conflict, and as you look at this flow chart, if you start at your left and work across, you'll see that we basically are looking at the least impactful behavior in our community to the most impactful behavior. And what we are empowered to do is to work within our community. And I should say that there are only 2 paid employees, there are 2.5 paid employees in our organization, and yet we have close to 50 volunteers who do the actual work. So this is truly a community-based operation. It was intended to be that way from the start, and it has been that way. We could not provide the service without our volunteers. And these volunteers that we train we give them free rein to deal with the types of problems that come before them. And they base their activities with people who have committed some type of an offense or crime based on restorative justice practices. When someone creates a harm within their community, and this could be in a family, this could be in a school, this could be in the Brattleboro town, it could be in Windham County. It doesn't, whatever you define as your community or the community that you're in at the moment, if someone creates a harm within that community, they hurt someone else. They do something that is more or less, or probably, purposefully hurtful to one or more people. The idea is that in restorative justice, instead of saying, gee, what did they do? they did this bad thing, the court says you need to be punished according to law. What we say is you need to make repair to the people in that community that you harmed. And this is a principle that is long-standing for centuries in many communities and cultures and tribal nations. We've just more or less, here in the States, have kind of picked this up since the 70s, and it's kind of become slowly kind of word of mouth, one person at a time is converted to this process. It's a paradigm shift. One needs to get their mind around the fact that punishment is not necessarily the only thing to be done. It may be appropriate in some situations, but in order to bring that person and back into your community and move on, there's got to be a process by which that person can address what they did, hear from their victim the impact of their crime and or harm, and then figure out what it is they can do to make some type of reparation. So as you walk across it, you'll see reparative panels. That's a lot of what we do, and that's exactly what it says. They're panels that work at repairing damage. So, so I just want to kind of go through this quickly and leave a lot of time for Q&A. On the far end, like I started with, we do interventions with residents in our town, with citizens in our town who have problems with neighbors. It can be anything from every time you snow blow, you blow it onto my yard and I have to shovel twice, type thing. Up to, you're putting sugar in my gas tank and you ruin my engine because we have this dispute going on. I'm ready to get my shotgun out next time. And then trying to intervene and de-escalate those types of situations through mediation. So we have a number of trained mediators in this town. In fact, the state of Vermont's got a lot of trained mediators looking to actually get paid for what they do. There's a great college in the state, Woodbury College, who churns out bachelor's and master levels mediators and conflict resolvers. However, there are not that many paying jobs, and usually it's in connection with an attorney's office. Be that as it may, people here in town that we know who have gone through the program or some other program, gotten trained, really want to use their skill. So we use them to conduct these mediations. From there, we also do things you may see us occasionally out and about, either doing a survey in town or in some way figuring out a process by which we can resolve a more community-wide conflict or a neighborhood conflict. And a couple of years ago, we were giving out cookies. If you filled out a survey, I don't know if anybody took advantage of that, but I think we gave out 250 cookies, and Bob was part of the giving of the cookies. So, and he got one too. But that type of thing, we were asked by the select board to be involved in that process, so we said, of course. So there's a number of things that we do around resolving community conflict or neighborhood conflict. Then when something goes up the scale in terms of severity, and the person has a conflict and they do resort to fisticuffs to settle it, or they resort to keying a car because somebody's boyfriend was cheating on his girlfriend and she didn't like that other woman and she's going to key the car. Well, that happens. That happens right here in Brattleboro. I think you know that. Happens everywhere. So those conflicts might come our way. And then we end up dealing with the person who committed the offense, but we bring the victim in, or if the victim is unable to come or does not want to come to the process, that is when our community-trained volunteers act as the voice for the victim and are able to say what it is they would think the victim would need to have said on their behalf. So it's not rocket science, folks. I mean, I think, once you get into it and you see typical situation that you have a DUI person that comes in, hey, I didn't hurt anybody, I just was driving drunk, And then we start investigating and who was infected in some way? Nobody. The cop pulled me over for a broken taillight. I could have gotten away with it. I have hundreds of times. And okay, fine. So what's happened since? Well, I lost my license, and I have to pay all these fines. Well, where did the money for the fines come from? Well, our family vacation next year took it out of that. Anybody impacted? Well, my wife has to drive me down here every month. Where do you live, Wilmington? Well, that's kind of a hardship. Yeah, I guess so. So you start looking at the impact to the people around you in your life. It may not just be if there's not a direct victim, there may not be a direct victim, but it's other people affected in your life. So we talk about that, and then we can also, like the drunk drivers, say, well, we share these roads, and we all take a social contract when we get our license to drive to the best of our ability. So if you're texting, drinking, putting on makeup, what are the things you see people doing on the road? If you're doing any of those things, you're a distracted driver, you're putting the rest of us at risk. So we talk about that. Depending on how quickly the individual picks up on this message, they move through a process and then they come up with a repair. Sometimes that repair is some of the things that you're aware of, like community service work, but more that we try to do is figure out a way to tailor the repair to the community in a meaningful way. So if, in some situations, we had a guy that did donuts in a schoolyard because he was drunk, and he knocked down the community garden the kids had put together. So he came back and got the lumber and materials and rebuilt that garden, and that was his repair. Another guy, drunk driver, crashed through a fence, rolled his truck. Luckily, he didn't kill himself. It was a neighbor of his. He came back, and before he even went to court, he came back and repaired that fence. He rebuilt it. So these are the types of things we're talking about, where we are able to make amends to the people we've harmed. When it goes to court, I don't know how much I want to get into the details, but it probably isn't all that important, but we have various ways of involving ourselves within the criminal system, and we go to arraignments. We are there when the judge is listening to pleas, and we are able to talk to people if one of their consequences is to do a reparative process. And we can talk with that individual then. So those three little arrows under reparative panels are some of the fine points of what we do. Then on the far end, once a person has really done something egregious, and it really has to be fairly serious to get yourself in jail. And I think you all know, or should know, that Vermont has one of the highest incarceration rates per capita of any state in the country. We've had that for some time now. It's not a really good title that we want to hold, but unfortunately we've got it. So about 15 years ago, the legislature started looking and saying, this is a one-way ticket to nowhere. We have got to change the direction of how we're doing business. That's when the restorative justice concept came into being, and why the Department of Corrections, of all people, picked up on it. And they recognized that here we have this silo over here of $120 million. Every year we put into bricks, mortar, and guards. And over here we have a $5 million operation called Community and Restorative Services. Well, that's a start. No other state has that. Vermont's the only one that's got something like that. And within that little $5 million, they fund administrators like myself across the state to do the types of work that we do here. So the same thing that's happening here is happening around the state. So people get the chance to go through this process. Research has shown, UVM has done research with this process, and it's found that there's a reduction in recidivism of between 12 and 25% when someone goes through a reparative process. It's a very significant amount. In the corrections field, you usually see about 60% recidivism, all things put together. So to impact that number is significant. When a person does a serious crime that they do end up serving time for, we are on the far end of that process, because we know 95% of the prisoners that are serving time in jail today will be back in Brattleboro, if this is where they came from. They'll be back in Brattleboro, Windham County, when their time is done. 95%. So there's only 5% that are locked up pretty much forever, and those are the big front page headline dudes that do multiple murders. I'm going to be interested to see what happens to this very pathetic situation with the nursing aide that used insulin to, allegedly used insulin to kill a patient. And it's a real tragedy for our community, and that has a big impact. But we do intervene, and we do intervene with some of the more heinous crimes. We see men who have committed sexual assaults against children. And they're probably, well, if you go to a prison or if you've seen any of the documentaries, they are considered the scum of the earth. And they're down at the bottom in the pecking order in a prison. Murderers are held in much more high regard. So when you look at that, they are usually segregated, like they are here in Vermont, in their own units for their own protection, so they don't get pummeled all the time. The thing is this, is that we have come to see through our education and research that, and I think it's kind of common sense, that an individual is more than the crime that they commit. So when we call someone a sex offender, or we call someone a murderer, actually that is an act of which they did. They murdered someone. They sexually assaulted someone. It doesn't define them as a person, and it doesn't talk about all that they are. So what we do is we reach into and connect with that humanity that exists in all people, so that engaging that person upon discharge, we can help them recognize what they need to do to uphold and maintain community standards of conduct. And that's what our circles of support and accountability do. Community advisory panel, and that kind of is a free-floating group that looks to make sure that the community interests are upheld at all times. So that is kind of a special little niche right there. At any rate, that's kind of where I want to go with this. I want to just give you an overview of what we do, and certainly would be interested in taking any questions.
On the left-hand side of the chart, at the pre-offense stage, when something is a dispute between neighbors, how does it come to you? How does the snowblower situation get to you?
Very good question. We have an arrangement with our state's attorney here, Tracy Schreiber, everybody's familiar with her name. We have an arrangement with her through an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, that she will allow us to deal with 6 categories of crime. They're very low-level crimes. This would be a situation, a dispute, a fight by mutual affray where there's just 2 guys duking it out because they're drunk after the bar closes. Those kind of situations, noise violations, we haven't seen any of those yet. We do have an ordinance about that, but and then more likely shoplifting. We do see a lot of those cases. So what we have in this agreement is that our local police department, when they go to a situation, see one of these crimes happening, they have the opportunity to offer the individual, the owner of the store or the receiver of the harm, if you will, the victim, they give them the opportunity to use this process as opposed to filing charges with the state's attorney and taking the case as a criminal matter. So we have, kind of first dibs, if you will, on community conflict. So that if the police see this as an applicable offense, they bring it to us, like in this situation. We then contact both parties, and just like in a mediation, you can imagine, if both parties aren't willing to sit down, look what happened to the skateboarding situation. Both parties weren't able to come to the table. You have no mediation. So if we don't get the victim and the offender to agree to come, the offender has no choice. They're coming, or they're going to face the judge. So they're typically very motivated to come, but it's up to the victim to see the value of this process. And we have certain merchants in town we've worked with who do see the value, and when they get ripped off, they want to come and sit in this and talk to the individual, who's done this to them, because it's a very meaningful process. When you can sit with your victim, you can sit with your offender and say to them, as a shop owner, I'm only allowed 5% overage or loss, and for damages and loss. And when you steal from me, and others do, I lose my profit margin because it comes right out of my profit after that 5%. The company only allows me that much. So people don't know that. Kids think, well, or whatever. Gee, they're insured. They're rich. They're going to be okay. They're a big company. It's not that way. So it's a matter of, that's one for instance of how people understand the impact.
Does any of this this work go into the prisons?
Good question. Only in those cases where we have an offender who's in prison currently being referred to us for release work. So we do that transitional piece. So our services will be limited to one individual who's been identified that we interview in prison and determine that they are eligible for our services. Now when I say eligible, what does that mean? It means that they are taking responsibility for their actions. Not everybody, but most of the people we're going to see have done a violent crime against someone else. And so we want them to demonstrate remorse to the harm they created to that victim, that they're taking full responsibility and they're accountable for that crime, not minimizing, not making excuses, not saying I was high on drugs, but to say, I committed that crime, and I wish I could do it over and take it back. So we get that kind of basic commitment to this process, then we can engage them. And our COSA team will go up to prison and start meeting with that person, sometimes 6 months in advance, sometimes as much as a year, to start building a relationship, because this COSA team, it's all based on that relationship we build with the individual. We may, in fact, that COSA team may, in fact, be the only group in town who is accepting and non-judgmental of this individual. That person may be well known in the community and has been marginalized and outcast for good cause. For most people, they say, wow, I remember when the guy sexually assaulted this little girl. It's like, we don't want this scumbag back in our community. I mean, that's understandable. We're outraged. But the reality is that they're coming back, and how would you like them to come back? As someone who is welcomed in the community while we're watching them, or someone who sneaks in the back door, hopefully nobody knows they're living up to Molly Stark, and they try to get through day to day, okay, by going under the radar. Statistics and research shows that those guys are typically going to be the ones to reoffend, because they're feeling bitter, angry, frustrated, and the triggers that may lead to another assault are all being pushed. That's one of the things we recognize is in place. So we know that it makes a lot of sense to invite that person back into the circle of community.
My neighborhood, Clark Canal, we've had a conflict that has been brewing for years. It was high profile a few years ago. One neighbor had surveillance cameras, and there was a lot of polarization. It smolders, it flares up, it dies down. It's been going on for years. We had the chief of police come to the Clark Canal Community Association, and basically what he said in essence is, well, we're not able to do anything. He never once mentioned Community Justice Center or suggested that we bring it for mediation. So I got two questions. One, it seems like this very much, the process you described very much depends on some police or state's attorney official proactively making the suggestion, or else it just won't happen. Or my second part is members of the community may not know that this opportunity to work on conflicts is available. Are you doing any outreach? Because I haven't seen it. I know about it because my wife is on a panel. Otherwise, I wouldn't, and now I'm here, but I wouldn't even know that there's a way to resolve conflict. So I guess I also wanted you to address the specific situation on Clark Canal, whether you've been aware of it and whether there has been any initiative.
Right. No, it doesn't take the police to make the offer. People can come to us. Typically, we work with I'll get to your question specifically, Stephen, in a minute. People have come to us through the Brattleboro Housing Authority because there's been multiple times there's issues within their residential settings there, and people, obviously, elderly amongst us and disabled, don't feel very empowered in handling situations. Not always, but typically in those kinds of environments, we see this. So we make ourselves available to help mediate or in some way facilitate a dialogue where conflict can be resolved. In your situation, and specifically Clark Canal, I know that going back a few years with the video surveillance person, and it ended in a tragedy. It wasn't directly with this person, and one could not point a finger, but as you may remember, it resulted in a very tragedy where a woman who had a mental instability ended up killing herself because she, you know, one of the things was that I guess we'd say exacerbated the situation was this gentleman that was surveilling the neighborhood, I guess for drug deals or whatever to try to.
Everybody is being drug dealers.
Right.
People that clearly were not.
Right, and this gentleman thought everybody was doing drug dealing, or many people were, and he was videotaping to provide evidence to the police. And I know that Chief Wren came in, and I was just starting at the Justice Center myself back then, but I do remember that in the papers. And what did happen in the aftermath of that, and I don't know how much before it ended in that situation, is we had a police social worker on staff here, Ms. Greer, and she is no longer there and no longer here as of just this year, but she's been providing services that where the police see a problem within a family, maybe domestic violence or potential domestic violence, and is it Sarah or Susan? I always forgot.
Sarah.
Sarah, right? Thank you. Sarah would do some intervention with the family. So there was that level of engagement. We offered to be engaged in the Clark Canal. It wasn't taken up. So I just want to say that one of the things I do, the first thing I read in the paper every day is letters to the editor. At any rate,